Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Saturday afternoon, April 9th. We're now entering week 13 of Political Science 3143 for the spring 2022 term, Comparative Governments. And everybody, what we have on the syllabus for this week is Russia. And of course, Russia is very much on the tips of everyone's tongues because of the conflict with Ukraine that took place going back to February with the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. So Russia is, of course, very, very important for us to learn about under contemporary circumstances. Everybody, let me say just a word about what we've got coming up. We're approaching the latter part of the course now, if we're not already in it. We'll have a discussion next week, another discussion the following week, and a quiz the week after that. And that will bring us up to our complement of 7 discussions and 7 quizzes. And at that point, after about another week, we'll be ready for the final exam. So no discussions or quizzes this week, but we will be running a discussion on Russia next week. And after that, there will be one more discussion and one more quiz before the final exam. For next week, I've given you a couple of articles to read. One, a quite lengthy blog post. You have a short article to look at by the former Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times. And another much longer entry to look at. This is a blog post by a Russian reporter, Farida Rustamova. Now, it's not clear to me whether Ms. Rustamova is in Russia or whether she's contacting her sources from outside the country. But either way, she seems to have very good sources. Formerly worked for the British Broadcasting Corporation Russian Language Service. And this is an article or a post on Ms. Rustamova's website that's been widely circulated and discussed quite a bit in the international press the past couple of weeks. It's dated March 31st, I believe. So ask yourself as you look at this how you might react if you found yourself in a country in this situation. Something has happened that has radically altered life within the country, and there doesn't seem to be much dissent permitted about it. Okay. Furthermore, it sounds as though everyone that you may meet, at least in leadership circles in Russia, is going along. You might find it hard to imagine yourself in a situation like that in your country, but you just never know. It's quite a volatile situation we're entering into here in the world, with big changes that have taken place and more to come, exactly what we don't know. So that's the question I've set for you to discuss in the discussion next week. I'll put it off till next week because we've got a fair amount of material to look at, especially this post by Ms. Rustamova. It may take you a while to get through that, so set a little bit of time aside for that. Looking at the class notes, perhaps, and the assignment for the textbook next week. Okay, try to set yourself some time aside to look at the material for the discussion, and we'll do that next week. Now, to say just a word about Russia, of course, students may realize that more than likely it may have been before your lifetime that the episode happened that we described as the end of the Cold War, going back to 1990 and 91, and the dissolution of the country that was known as the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, a country that was an ally of the United States during World War II, but once the war ended, conflict arose, and both the United States and the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, and there was a lengthy standoff that we know as the Cold War that did not end until the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s. So where there was one country, the Soviet Union, it dissolved, and what were known as the 15 Union republics that made up the Soviet Union all became independent countries. By far the largest of those, and the predominant one, was the Russian Federation, which we consider the successor government to the Soviet Union. But another one of those 15 Union republics was Ukraine, which Russia has now invaded and seeks to dominate, if not completely take over. And this, of course, has thrown the world into quite a considerable state of disorder, as it has implications far beyond the borders of Russia and Ukraine, for that matter. And I know that students will have heard quite a bit about this. Let me say just a word about what you'll be studying about Russia as you look at your material from the textbook and the class notes. We tend to want to assume very often that the model represented by the United States, the Western European countries, and some other countries, liberal democracy, is something that everyone wants to emulate or should emulate. That may not be the case. Not everybody sees it that way. Not everyone may want to do that. Okay? There may be a case to be made that it wouldn't necessarily be best for every country in the world to attempt to do that. Perhaps it is, perhaps not. That's a question for another day. Russia, the Russian Federation, attempted to move in this direction for a time after the end of the Cold War, but it didn't work out very well, you might say. For one thing, Russia underwent a policy of what was called shock therapy to convert it from an economy, what was called a command economy, in which the government owned and run and tried to operate every economic entity in the country, to what we would call a capitalist economy on the basis of free market competition. Okay. The transition arguably did not go that well. Prices increased dramatically, wages fell, unemployment was high. This situation went along for about a decade until Vladimir Putin took power. And some people say, if the Russian people today don't think much of capitalism and liberal democracy, that may be the reason why. They associate it with terrible hardship. Putin then took power, and in the estimate of most observers, well, within Russia, Mr. Putin himself would tell you it's still democratic. It's as democratic as any other country, he would say. It doesn't look that way, of course, to many, many other people. What seems to have happened is that Russia gradually moved away from a nascent liberal democracy into what looks more and more like an authoritarian regime with the passage of time. There are still multiple political parties in Russia, but the predominant one, Mr. Putin's party, at least the one he's associated with, United Russia, gets something like 60% to 2/3 of the vote in elections. And some people believe that the reason for this is that Mr. Putin has orchestrated the competition between United Russia and the other parties that are permitted to continue to exist. The main ones are the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the Liberal Democratic Party, and a party called A Just Russia. Now, many people would tell you that what's going on is that Mr. Putin is attempting to orchestrate competition among these parties in such a way as to give an appearance that there's still liberal democracy and political freedom, but he has stacked the game in such a way that he and United Russia always win. As a matter of fact, in the last presidential election, Mr. Putin formally ran as an independent, but with very, very strong support from United Russia. Okay, how did Mr. Putin bring this about? Largely, it is believed, by increasing his dominance and the dominance of himself and his supporters over the media in Russia, and at the same time building for himself quite a powerful political machine. Okay. This is all described in your class notes and in the material you've been assigned in the textbook for our unit on the syllabus for next week on Russia. So I hope you will take a look at all that, draw your own conclusions, and once you take a look at the class notes and textbook material, set some time aside to look at these readings that we've assigned for you for the discussion next week and see what you think of that. And think of how you might deal with it if you found yourself in a similar situation. Your countries become, to a large extent, cut off from the rest of the world, international pariah, we sometimes call it. But most everyone especially the leadership of the country, seems to be, shall we say, rallying behind the flag, and there doesn't seem to be much room for dissent from the path on which Mr. Putin has set Russia. Okay, so that's what we will try to discuss next week. Look at the material in your textbook and in the class notes in the meantime. And we'll perhaps talk to you about that a bit more when we talk to you once again a week from now at this time. Take it easy.